The world's forgotten war. After a year of airstrikes, we ask if Saudi Arabia is any closer to achieving its goal in Yemen. Also on today's program, a momentous day for Myanmar as the country swears in an elected civilian leader for the first time in half a century. And in Picture This, Japan bursts into bloom for the start of the cherry blossom season. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. It's been just over a year since a Saudi-led coalition began airstrikes in Yemen in support of its exiled government and against Houthi rebels backed by Iran. Yemen was already one of the world's poorest countries, but the fighting has displaced millions and brought it to the brink of famine. Since the airstrikes began, the country has endured more than 6,000 deaths, half of them civilians. While Saudi airstrikes have helped some of Yemen's pre-war government return, including President Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi, they have not managed to shift the Houthis from their base in the capital, Sana'a. Nor have they addressed the threat from Al-Qaeda and Daesh-linked terror groups. Today's Newsmaker is Saudi Arabia's coalition, as we ask what a year of airstrikes has achieved in Yemen.
A conflict that has left a country divided. And its people devastated. This week marks the first anniversary of Yemen's war, since the country became a battleground between the Saudi-led coalition and Iran-backed Houthi fighters. In Sana'a, a show of resilience by Salah's supporters as they mark a year of airstrikes. The country is more divided than ever. Yemen's Shia Houthi rebels still control the capital Sana'a, while the deposed government of Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi holds parts of the south, including the port city, Aden. And from the security vacuum caused by the political uncertainty, Al-Qaeda and Daesh have thrived. The country's former longtime president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who resigned in the midst of Yemen's uprising in 2011, has allied with the Houthis. And Hadi took refuge in Riyadh, only to return to Yemen in September to reclaim the seat of power. But a year in, Yemen's front lines seem as entrenched as ever, as a Saudi-led bombing campaign has brought the country to the brink of collapse.
The level of humanitarian situation is becoming disastrous, the level of civilian casualties, so we cannot afford having this war continue. So this is really our last chance.
More than 6,200 people have been killed since the coalition joined the war. 2.3 million others have been displaced. An estimated 4 in 5 people in Yemen are in need of aid. 19 million lack access to clean water. 14 million lack access to urgent medical care. The UN says children are the worst affected. Every day for the past year, at least 6 children have been killed or injured in the fighting. 60% of those killed died in airstrikes. Both sides are accused of committing war crimes. As the suffering continues, so too do the efforts to find a solution. But Yemen's protracted conflict now reflects various foreign interests in the region. The war and the peace process in the region's poorest country is being driven from outside its borders. Yemen's northern neighbor, Saudi Arabia, says it's protecting its borders, but it's also countering the influence of its main regional rival, Iran, which backs the Houthis.
I believe Iran should stay out of Yemen. It has no business in Yemen. An Iranian general was quoted as saying that Iran is prepared to send troops to Yemen to help, or forces to Yemen to help the Yemeni people, and that because Iran cares deeply about Yemen. Iran doesn't care about Yemen.
Last week saw yet another attempt to end the fighting. The UN announced the warring parties agreed to a cessation of hostilities due to begin on April 10th. Some say this is Yemen's last chance at securing peace. Yemen can ill afford another failed ceasefire, or it may indeed become a failed state. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss Saudi Arabia's intervention in Yemen is Rawan Shaif, a filmmaker and journalist who has covered the conflict from the ground. And in Jeddah is Khalid M. Betarfi, an academic and senior columnist at the Saudi Gazette. Thanks both of you for joining us. Rawan, let's start with you. 1 year on, after so much death and destruction, do we know who's winning?
I mean, it's very clear in Yemen that nobody is winning this war. In terms of what's happening on the ground, it's a catastrophic mess. The humanitarian crisis is beyond repair. 2.5 million people have been displaced. 1.3 million children are now suffering from malnutrition. And it is safe to say that all sides are losing this war, regardless of what politicians may say.
Khalid, all sides are losing this war.
In wars, there is no winners. This war started 3 years ago when the Houthis started their march towards Sana'a. And only last year, the Arab coalition decided to help the government that they imprisoned first and then chased to Aden and then threw out of the government and the country. But as your guest said, there is no winners in war, and that's why we are looking forward to peace.
Khalid, is there any regret within Saudi Arabia for all the death and destruction and the civilian deaths particularly caused by the airstrikes?
Of course, there is any death, even one person, is a great regret. That's why Saudis go a great deal to avoid hitting civilian areas. Remember, only 2 days ago, Ali Abdullah Saleh, which is the most wanted person, was in public in Sana'a among his own supporters and among the Houthis. That was a good chance for any country or any army to destroy it once and for all, but they didn't because there were civilians out there. And we are trying our best, but they are not doing the same way. They are not treating the Yemenis the same way because, look, in Taz, they are still shelling civilian areas indiscriminately. Sometimes because they have dumb bombs, but in many times because they wanted to. They want to punish these people for not accepting them. There is a difference between indiscriminate and discriminate attacking or targeting.
I get your reasoning, but you're saying that the Saudis should be praised for the civilians that they did not kill. I'm asking you, do they regret the 3,000 civilians that they did kill?
No, we didn't kill 3,000. That's what they say. That's what their propaganda is saying. We shouldn't wait until the end of this war to do a clear, thorough investigation and see exactly what happened. You cannot just take it from the mouths of the Houthis and just throw it around and tell the Saudis, you killed 3,000. How did you count them? Did you count them? Who counted them? How many Kurds the Turk has killed? How many Armenians? We don't know. The Armenians say millions, but the Kurds says no. I mean, you need a thorough investigation before you throw something like this on the Saudis.
Okay, but I'm relying on United Nations and Amnesty's numbers here, not on the Houthis' numbers. You would agree that this is the UN and Amnesty International?
Where are those people on the ground? Are they sitting in New York and London and saying that? It's a land at war.
Okay.
How many people are killed in the Daesh areas or in Taliban areas? Do we know
so what we'll do
an investigation?
in the future, perhaps I'll look forward to you and maybe a representative of Amnesty or the UN, and they can go through their methodology and we can have a separate discussion. But let me move on for the moment. Rawan, so you have this situation where you have the Houthi group and their backers, and you have the Saudi-led coalition and Al-Qaeda and Daesh and a secessionist movement in the south as well. What is your biggest fear right now, even if there is a peace deal, Rawan, given that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is there, Daesh is there, and a secessionist movement in the south as well?
I mean, effectively, just judging from being on the ground for as long as I have, and that's been for the last 10 months, it's safe to say what Saudi has done has bomb the north of Yemen into the hands of the Houthis, because as much as they are anti-Houthi and anti-GPC, they're very vehemently anti-Saudi. And in the south, what they've done is bomb the country into AQAP and ISIS hands. And what's worrying is that even if the peace talks are successful, and even if the war does end, and if the war I mean by the bombing, it will take a very, very long time in order for there to be peace on the ground, because you have the entire social fabric in Yemen completely destroyed between the north and the south, and it's created a political vacuum which enables groups, radical groups such as AQAP and ISIS, to thrive.
Khalid, do you agree with that? That in this vacuum, Al-Qaeda and Daesh will insert themselves?
Al-Qaeda and Daesh is the creation of Ali Abdullah Saleh. Once you get the head of the snake, then you can get the rest of the snake. Al-Qaeda and Daesh is our enemies as much as it is for anybody else. We have suffered more than any other countries in the world. So the war against Al-Qaeda and Daesh has already started in Yemen and will continue once we have peace in Sana'a and Sa'da. Then we will have our full force against Al-Qaeda and Daesh. It's not going to be a big of a problem if we can get their head, the head of the mafia, Ali Abdullah Saleh.
Yeah, Khalid, you mentioned Ali Abdullah Saleh a lot. I wonder, how much influence do you think Iran has as well currently on the ground in terms of supporting the Houthis? In your opinion, as a Saudi, how much influence do they have?
A lot of influence, but not after the start of the storm, the decisive storm, because we cut them from sea and air and ground. It's very difficult for them now to deliver any help to the Houthis. And that's why their strength are getting down, and they are looking for a way out, because we cut them off the Iranian support and influence.
Rawan, there's a perception that Yemen is just a playground as a proxy war between Saudi and Iran in a Cold War. Khalid saying the Iranian influence is not as great as perhaps has been perceived by some people. Do you think that as well?
I definitely agree on the Iranian role not being as great as people think it is. It hasn't been present during the past 12 months. I mean, it's as far as it to go that you could easily say that the Iranians are supporting the Houthis via proxy, but not in terms of weapons or anything else, just via logistics. And I think this is something that has been overplayed in the media greatly. But in Yemen, what seems to be the case is Saudi sort of showing what kind of power they have to everyone else, rather than it being Iran being actively involved in what's happening in Yemen.
Rawan, the Saudi coalition has the support of Western nations, especially in terms of weapons, and they have political support as well. What's your message to those international powers like the United States, who, if not directly, tacitly are supporting what's going on in Yemen, Rawan?
I mean, UK and US involvement has been very present in Yemen. There have been munitions that have been supplied to Saudi Arabia by the UK and the US, found in civilian areas that have been targeted. And I think they are equally complicit in what's happening in Yemen as much as the Saudis, because they have a responsibility to sell arms to the people that should be trusted with such weapons and not used on civilians in places like Yemen.
Khalid, what do you think of that?
Well, I think we have to have a thorough investigation of what's going on, and whether those killed are militant or militia or civilians. It's just not any person. You count the heads and you say those are civilians, because then where are the militant? Where are the soldiers? If all those killed were civilians, I think we need to wait until the dust is out and we can see through the fog and do a thorough investigation by the United Nations and by any neutral party. But right now, it's very difficult to do that.
Khalid, is Saudi Arabia under pressure from its Western allies to finish this war quickly?
well, we are under pressure from ourselves. We want to finish this war because, as I said, just one person is killed or one home is destroyed is hurting us. Half the Yemenis are in Saudi Arabia, and many of the tribes in Saudi Arabia are originally from Yemen, including mine. So we want this to end. We want this we want to concentrate on something more productive, like rebuilding the country. So we don't need outside pressure to end the war. We want to end the war as soon as possible.
Rawan, what's the best case scenario for you in a year's time?
I think there is no best case scenario in Yemen. I mean, in terms of what Khaled has said in calling for an independent investigation, I think the best thing to do is call for an independent investigation. But people like Amnesty, like Human Rights Watch, have actually been on the ground in the past year and have visited very frequently to see the effects of what's happening in Yemen. And as long as nobody's held accountable for what's happening in Yemen, there will be no solution in 10 months or in a year or in 2 years. I definitely think that the bombing campaign is not the worst thing that is happening in Yemen. I think there are various things that have been exacerbated by the bombing campaign that will continue for at least 10 years after the war is over.
Okay, that's not a very optimistic note at which to end the discussion, but we are out of time. Rawan Shaif and Khalid M. Batarfi, thank you very much, both of you, for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, Myanmar moves away from military rule as a civilian president takes charge. And in Picture This, a sign that spring is finally here. It's cherry blossom season in Japan. Myanmar has inaugurated its first civilian president in over 50 years, bringing an end to decades of military rule. It marks a significant step towards democracy, but the military will retain a quarter of seats in parliament, and relations between the armed forces and the new ruling party will be crucial in ensuring any progress is lasting. The Newsmakers' Duncan Crawford sent this report from Yangon.
"5 years ago, it was an international pariah and Southeast Asia's most secretive country. Ruled by a military junta for more than half a century, the generals who ran Myanmar were accused of human rights violations and cracked down on almost all dissent. But in 2012, the country began to turn a corner, and on Wednesday, Myanmar swore in its first civilian leader in decades. It's being seen as a significant step towards democracy. Tinjor took the oath of office, promising to be faithful to the people. But his title of president is essentially in name only, and Wednesday's handover of power is largely ceremonial. Aung San Suu Kyi, leader of the now ruling National League for Democracy Party, the Nobel Peace Prize winner and campaigner for democracy. While Myanmar was under military rule, she became a symbol of fighting against repression and spent years under house arrest and praised abroad as a model of passive resistance. She led calls for an end to military rule, and when Myanmar went to the polls in November, it was her that people voted for. Her party won 80% of the contested seats in a historic election. Yet the constitution of Myanmar was written by the military, and it banned Suu Kyi from becoming president. She has said she will be above the president instead and rule from behind the scenes. Even as Tinjor is handed power, he's already being seen as a proxy president, handpicked by Suu Kyi to lead the country. While this is being seen as a huge step, there's still some concern about reform in Myanmar.
While it's accepted that Aung San Suu Kyi will really hold the power, the new president will still have a big role to play. Tinjor will need to show he can tackle poverty and deal with ethnic tension and corruption. But perhaps most importantly, he'll need to manage his relationship with the military.
The military still holds 25% of parliamentary seats, giving it the power to veto any changes to the constitution, and will appoint its own nominees for 3 key ministries: Defence, Home Affairs and Border Affairs. So, as Myanmar celebrates and takes steps towards a delicate democracy, the military's political power still looms large. Duncan Crawford, The Newsmakers, Yangon, Myanmar.
Well, joining me now to discuss Myanmar's political transition in more detail is Peter Popham in London. He's author of the book The Lady and the Generals and has worked in Myanmar over the past 25 years. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Popham. Is Tinjor a ceremonial proxy president here?
Yes, I think that's correct. Yep, he's got no political experience. He was appointed president because he'd got quite a long career as a civil servant. So he's intelligent, he's well educated, got at least 2 degrees from foreign universities. But above all, he has been a friend of Aung San Suu Kyi since they were both at the same high school in Rangoon a long time ago.
Okay, so let's ask the question then. Can Aung San Suu Kyi and Tinjor in power work with this constitution as it is?
I think that's the most important question and the most difficult question to answer because they've made it, the party and Suu Kyi herself have made it clear for a long time that changing the constitution is a major priority for them. But for their part, the military have made it clear that they do not want to change the constitution, which is their guarantee of continuing to have a big say in politics. The danger, as I see it, is that the 2 sides can get locked into an impasse in which the army refuses to budge on the constitution and nothing gets done. This is, as I say, this is the thing that might worry one looking at a country with desperate problems which are in urgent need of solutions.
The army has 25% of parliamentary seats by law as things stand. Do you think that that is still too much power in their hands?
Well, the National League for Democracy certainly think it's completely unreasonable, and it's far from democratic. I mean, one could say that across Southeast Asia, from sort of Bangladesh through Indonesia, the military have played a more or less important role in politics in many countries. In Thailand, they've recently, once again, taken direct control. So to expect the army to remove themselves completely is probably wildly optimistic. But at the moment, they call the shots in Burma. Their control of the Home Ministry in particular is absolutely critical. They could declare martial law and close down the democratic process at the drop of a hat. So I think the Democrats are worried about the fact that they are still sitting there really dominant in the political setup.
Yeah, before we have to go, I want to ask you about Aung San Suu Kyi and the Rohingya. She's been criticized for her refusal to speak out on the plight of Rohingya Muslims. And then recently there was her alleged tantrum at being interviewed by a Muslim, BBC anchor Michelle Hussein. Just how damaged is her standing internationally because she does not want to talk about the Rohingya?
I think that she's played it very badly. I mean, clearly, the Rohingya are a very much persecuted minority in the west of the country. At the same time, the other people living in the same state, the Arakanese Buddhists, have also suffered from communal violence at the hands of the Rohingya. So it's not all black and white, as Suu Kyi says. She ought to have been able to find a way through this in which she declared her sympathy for the Rohingya and her desire to see them given citizenship. But for reasons which are not entirely clear, she finds this difficult to say. So I suspect it will continue to be a problem for her internationally for some time.
Peter Popham, thank you very much for joining us. In today's Picture This, it's cherry blossom season and Japan has started the traditional springtime celebrations of Hanami. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker has been the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. We asked what they've achieved in a year of airstrikes and whether there's a solution in sight for a country left on the brink of collapse by years of fighting and instability. What is clear is that Yemen's population is suffering, above all the children. And while Saudi Arabia may have thought entering the conflict was unavoidable, it may find a way out is harder to come by. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. As always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.